Let's start today with the camera angle at its widest. For over half a century now, and inadvertently, humanity has been writing an immense and important new book. That is the book of the dramatic changes in the lives of Homo sapiens since the widespread embrace in the 1960s of the sexual revolution. And make no mistake, what has happened since the invention of the birth control pill is indeed a revolution. It is every bit as much a revolution as the Industrial Revolution before it. In fact, the sexual revolution, I would argue, correctly understood, amounts to a second kind of industrial revolution. The first revolution was about the way humanity makes things, and the second is about the way humanity now remakes its very self. This second industrial revolution is the single most momentous social fact of our time around the world, and it's transforming societies on every continent. Some of those transformations were foreseen by that prophetic encyclical. Others were not foreseen, but still amount to powerful, if inadvertent, testimony that Humanae Vitae called one big thing right. The world after the sexual revolution would be a darker and more stunted world than humanity had known before. We are here today to talk about both kinds of ongoing transformations and to understand the light that they shed on the truth of 2,000 years of teaching. It's often said, especially during the last 5 years, that we should meet people where they are. In today's talk, we will try something similar. We will meet some of the facts about life in our new industrial revolution where they are. Now, to understand just how prophetic Humanae Vitae was, we need first to understand that we live in a moment of fantastic paradox. For 50 years, religious traditionalists, especially though not only faithful Catholics, have been widely marginalized and dismissed for resisting the revolution itself. They've been mocked in all the best places by secular society for upholding the age-old teaching shared by Judaism and Christianity to be fruitful and multiply. Yet during this same 50-year period, widespread defection from that teaching has scattered the Catholic flock like no other single force of division. As voices from the secular realm often taunt, the majority of American and other Catholics do not observe the teaching in their own lives. Simultaneously, secular people, for their part, find contraception to be not only permissible, but more and more a technology that they cannot live without. To many modern men and women, as governments and other organizations affirm, it is now a human right. Now, again, this juxtaposition of the majority secular view that the revolution is good and the minority religious view that says it is not invites us to explore a paradox. Empirical reality stands on the religious side, not the secular side. To say this is not a widely acknowledged fact is to understate wildly. It is not acknowledged at all by most people, and for sound reason. The sexual revolution has given rise to a rich and popular mythology all its own, a mythology that sustains it, even as the accumulation of empirical fact points otherwise. So, in what follows, I would like to narrow our camera lens to various fields and offer several examples of what Humanae Vitae got right. My purpose is to arm us, figuratively speaking, with empirical evidence so that we can defend ourselves when challenged by a secular majority about what is fact and what is fiction in these contentious matters. So let's look first to a subject that is said by a great many people to be of central importance. That is the state of modern women. Contraception, it was and is perennially asserted, will leave them happier and freer than before. Has it? Well, Humanae Vitae predicted that it would not. It predicted that the world after the revolution would be one in which men had less respect for women, excuse me, and in which strife between the sexes would rise accordingly. 10 years ago, on the 40th anniversary, I documented in the pages of First Things what social science and other secular sources were indicating about the sad and sometimes frantic state of modern women. I am not going to rehearse that evidence here, but it is abundant. 10 years later, I'd like to talk about new evidence that also points to the perspicacity of the encyclical's claims. So there is, as alluded to earlier, blue chip social science suggesting that female happiness across the United States and Europe has been declining over time. Other proofs of feminine misery also abound. Consider the angry, irrational tone of sexual politics today. This has become palpable across the political scene, especially in Washington, D.C., where I live. Consider the marches of the so-called resistance. Consider the hysteria over Supreme Court nominations and the demonstrations on the steps of the court these days. This angry irrationalism, I submit, is itself testimony to the poignant truth that the lives of many women born after the revolution are rife with pain and fury. In effect, they are behind enemy lines, and the lamentations that you hear from them amount to a form of Stockholm syndrome. These political developments amount to new signposts that Humanae Vitae was right in forecasting that adoption of artificial contraception would increase divisiveness between the sexes. Then, as also alluded to elsewhere, there is the continuing secular sex scandals of 2017 and 2018 and the hashtag #MeToo movement. What do these ongoing revelations about harassment in one realm after another tell us? Well, they tell us that the technological shock of widespread contraception licensed sexual predation. This, too, is not a theological judgment. It's an empirical one. Here, as elsewhere, the vindication of Humanae Vitae is being conducted by secular sources outside the Catholic Church. For example, the idea that birth control would license bad behavior by some men was foreseen in part by the social scientist Francis Fukuyama, not a Catholic. His 1999 book, The Great Disruption, made a point that echoes in Humanae Vitae, though based on a thoroughly secular analysis. And this is a quote. He wrote, "One of the greatest frauds perpetrated during the Great Disruption was the notion that the sexual revolution was gender neutral, benefiting women and men equally. In fact, the revolution served the interests of men and in the end put sharp limits on the gains that women might otherwise have expected," unquote. Almost 20 years later, his point is irrefutable. No longer does a man have to be a king or a master of the universe to abuse or prey upon women in unrelenting serial fashion. One only needs a world in which women are assumed to use contraception, in which they are assumed to be sexually available at all times. In other words, all one needs for the #MeToo movement is the world that we've had since the 1960s, the world that Humanae Vitae foresaw. There is a profound point of social justice embedded in this tragic outcome, by which I mean social justice for women. The revolution, as explained, shortchanges women. It sets them up for a life of ill use and exploitation by men who have no intention of committing themselves or starting families. Here's the take-home for those who care about social justice. Whether they mean to or not, Catholics who soft pedal or publicly reject the teachings of Humanae Vitae are participating in increasing the unhappiness of a great many women, present and to come. That includes Catholics who reject the encyclical, Catholics who support abortion, and Catholics who have made the spreading of abortion and contraception their vocation in life. Those who spread the culture of contraception deserve rebuke, including by clergy and hierarchy, because what they do hurts women. The culture of contraception turns women from being the partners of men into being the playthings of men. It is actually impossible to imagine a world more inimical to authentic female interests. Now, none of that is to say that women are the only people injured by the revolution. Again, empirical studies are on our side. The pain and confusion of our time is being captured more and more by social science and fresh analyses of the pill's destructive power. Let me recommend, by way of example, several books from the last 2 years alone, all of them outlining the new sexual cartography. Ashley McGuire's Sex Scandal, The Drive to Abolish Male and Female, which is about the social and political enforcement of androgyny. Mark Regnerus's Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy, an economic analysis of the radically changed incentives for marriage. Ryan T. Anderson's groundbreaking examination in When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment, and Mona Charon's Sex Matters, How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense. These are just a few of the books I could name, and all of them in different ways decisively overrule today's happy talk about the sexual revolution. And they deliver sound empirical measures of just some of the suffering that remains to be ameliorated out there. Another proof of what Humanae Vitae got right wasn't foreseen by the document itself, but is no less potent for that. It's the fact that some people outside the Catholic Church, in watching what the revolution has wrought, have come to see Humanae Vitae in a new and more favorable light. This includes some leading Protestants. This turnaround is one of the least reported religious stories of our time. It may even come to reconfigure Christianity in some parts of the world, replacing disunity over birth control with a new unity. More and more Protestant voices now question yesterday's nonchalance about contraception. Of course, this reconsideration is far from a majority view, but it manifests what any minority view must have in order to win over people: evidence and moral energy. And I'd like to give you just a few examples of quotes from the last 10 years alone. From a professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, quote, "Protestants have done themselves a disservice by ignoring Humanae Vitae's substantial statement on human anthropology and sexuality. We would be well served to study Paul VI's encyclical and take heed of its warnings," unquote. Here is a quote from the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. "Many evangelicals are joining the discussion about birth control and its meaning. Evangelicals arrived late to the issue of abortion, and we have arrived late to the issue of contraception, but we are here now." From a professor at Messiah College, "For evangelicals, an anti-contraception position is not seen as exclusively Roman Catholic, as it would have been in the past." From a popular evangelical blogger, "Whenever current events touch on life issues, evangelicals like me become increasingly uncomfortable with the contraception culture. We realize that we have so much more in common with Catholics who revere life than with radical feminists who revere the rights of women over all else." Or to summarize from a headline in the New York Times in 2012, quote, "More Protestants oppose birth control." And it isn't only Protestants. Consider this, written by a Mormon doctor a decade ago. Contraception is a heavy part of the fuel behind the sexual revolution and many of the problems in society that we're facing. I think Humanae Vitae is a prophetic statement, unquote. As many of you know, these second thoughts among Protestants and other non-Catholics are not so much a radical break from Christian tradition than a return to it. Church teaching on contraception, including Protestant teaching, followed an unbroken line until 1930. Interestingly, then as now, Protestants who were not at ease with abandoning traditional teaching invoked Rome for authority. Charles Gore, the Bishop of Oxford, objected to Resolution 15. He wrote that he had, quote, manifold reason to believe that in the case of birth prevention, the very strong tradition in the Catholic Church has been in the right and has divine sanction, unquote. The move by some non-Catholics toward Humanae Vitae today is partly a tacit declaration that in retrospect, the Bishop of Oxford was on the right side of the argument. The past half century has also borne out another important prediction of Humanae Vitae, the enduring fear that public authorities might impose these technologies on the citizenry, as Humanae Vitae warned. This has happened, of course, in China, with its long-standing barbaric one-child policy, replete with forced abortions, involuntary sterilizations, and gendercide, meaning the killing of millions of unborn girls for being girls. But it isn't only China. A softer kind of coercion has appeared in the United States and other Western nations where efforts have been made to link desired outcomes with mandatory birth control. In the 1990s and beyond, for example, some US judges backed state-imposed implantation of long-term contraceptives on women convicted of crimes. Such implied force was so egregious that, among others, the American Civil Liberties Union objected to it. And since I don't often get to cite the ACLU as an authority, I would like to read you what they said. Quote, the recent attempts to coerce women to use Norplant represent a reversion to an era of overt racism and eugenics, unquote. Now, this brings us to one more pressing fact about the pernicious influence of contraceptive thinking. This brings us to what we might call social coercion. By that, I mean using financial and other inducements to try and persuade certain people in other parts of the world to make fewer of themselves. I am referring to the efforts, including by some prominent self-described Catholics, to spread contraception in places that are poorer than ours is and where people are darker than many of us are. These efforts to keep down the number of darker people, incredibly enough, take place without so much as a shout out from anyone, as if racism never existed, as if eugenics never existed. This is, to repeat, an extraordinary fact of our time, and not a good one. Just 3 weeks ago, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron, as you just heard, once again called the issue of African fertility one of the most critical facing the continent. This was not a passing gaffe. This is an ongoing concern of his and of many other people who count themselves enlightened. Last year, at a speech in Germany of all places, Macron was at it again. He spoke of what he called Africa's civilizational crisis, which he identified in the fact that some women have 7 or 8 children. Now, why is the French president so preoccupied with other people's children? Or at least with the children of Africa? Perhaps not coincidentally, in Africa, both Protestants and Catholics lean toward traditionalism in moral thinking. My speech is all wet. It is in tradition-minded Africa that Christianity has grown explosively in the years since Humanae Vitae, as opposed to those nations whose Christian leaders have struggled and struggle still to change the rule book. Well, as the Pew Research Center put it in a report a few years ago, Africans are among the most morally opposed to contraception. Substantial numbers of people in Kenya, Uganda, and other sub-Saharan countries, Catholic and otherwise, agree with the proposition that contraception use is morally unacceptable. In Ghana and Nigeria, that number is more than half the population. Despite decades of secular proselytizing, many Africans have resisted the attempts of reformers to bring them into line with the secular Western sexual program, a program that includes diminishing the numbers of Africans. Now, let's pause over that one for just a minute. Do any of us believe that the world would be a better place with fewer of us in it? If not, why should we believe that in the case of Africans? Not surprisingly, some pushback is appearing. Nigerian-born Obianuju Ekiocha, author of the book Target Africa, Ideological Neocolonialism of the 21st Century, wrote an open letter to Melinda Gates, whose foundation dedicates impressive resources to spreading birth control among Africans and elsewhere. The author said, "I see this $4.6 billion buying us misery. I see it buying us unfaithful husbands. I see it buying us a retirement without the tender, loving care of our children." Now, it happens that Africans are not alone in rejecting the idea that the world would be better off with fewer of them in it. As one citizen of India put it to no less than Margaret Sanger some decades back, when he was targeted with the same message, quote, "It is futile to hope that the use of contraceptives will be restricted to the mere regulation of progeny. There is hope for a decent life only so long as the sexual act is definitely related to the conception of precious life," unquote. The author of those sentences is not Elizabeth Anscombe, whose famous 1972 essay, Contraception and Chastity, defended Humanae Vitae with exactly the same logic. No, the author of those sentences is Mahatma Gandhi, one more non-Catholic to affirm the reasoning behind Christian moral teaching. To summarize the point of this excursion, Humanae Vitae did not forecast a world in which mostly pale people of European origin would try to use contraception to keep down the numbers of mostly darker people. But to stand with Humanae Vitae is to stand against these obnoxious efforts. And Catholics should be proud to take that stand against anything that smacks of eugenics and racism, whether most of the rest of the world agrees with us or not, because it is the only place where a civilized person should stand. Another de facto vindication of the teachings of Humanae Vitae is also more visible in the rearview mirror than it ever could have been 50 years ago. That's the fact that the churches that have accommodated themselves to the sexual revolution have paid a catastrophic price. As a headline in The Guardian put it simply in 2016 on the eve of one more contentious Lambeth conference, quote, "The Anglican schism over sexuality marks the end of a global church," unquote. Now, in 1930, people would have been shocked if they had been told that the doctrinal war over sex would end up contributing to tensions within the Anglican Communion, that parts of the communion would go to legal war over churches and jurisdictions, as well as doctrine, or that the separation of North and South, Episcopal and Anglican, Africa and Europe, would yield divisions and subdivisions, sorrow and acrimony on a global scale. But this is what happened. In 1998, Bishop John Shelby Spong of Newark, New Jersey, a leader in the Episcopalian Church who urged an embrace of the revolution, published a book called Why Christianity Must Change or Die. The Christianity of which he spoke did change, and now it is dying. Here are some numbers from a volume published in 2016 called Growth and Decline in the Anglican Communion, 1980 to present. Around 2000, this is a quote, serious decline set in. Average Sunday attendance dropped by nearly 1/3 between 2000 and 2015. The rate of baptism has been cut almost in half over a 30-year period. And the most dramatic data is for marriages. In 2015, the Episcopal Church married less than a quarter of the number it married in 1980. The Anglican Communion is not alone. Data from all over show that the churches that jettison traditional moral teaching are now the ones that are hemorrhaging members. This is not to say that the Catholic Church in America will be spared from the pressures of secularization. Thanks to the latest rounds of scandals, the Catholic Church now has one more engine of secularization with which to do battle. But to focus on the collapse of the mainline Protestant population is to say that the facts of religious history make their own case in support of Paul VI's prophetic stance. Division descended on the Anglican Communion for doing exactly what dissenters from Humanae Vitae want the Catholic Church to do. That is, rewrite rules that many or most people find difficult. Surely anyone urging Rome to follow the same path today has a moral obligation to explain why Catholicism's fate will be different. So, in closing, I would like to share some new thoughts about the relationship between Humanae Vitae and its rejection and the current scandals. Of all the consequences of the revolution that could not have been foreseen 50 years ago, there is one final kind of damage that looms most ominously and portentously of all, and that is the ongoing damage being done to the church itself in several dimensions. The sexual revolution is locked in mortal combat with the church because the revolution undermines religious faith and practice in diverse and profound ways. The collapse of religiosity in Western societies cannot be understood apart from the collapse of the family. The same technological shock that disrupted the human family also disrupted the main transmission belt for religious belief and practice. Living in isolation from elemental ties, as many people do today, has rendered modern people more religiously tone deaf than their predecessors. The human family itself appears to be the symphony through which the voice of the Almighty is best heard. The scattering of that symphony via contraception and abortion has made the music harder to hear. But how does the church reach out in such a broken time? Surely not by ratifying brokenness. Surely not by telling people that their choices exercised on behalf of brokenness are good ones. This brings us to the relationship between the rejection of Humanae Vitae and the scandals that we now read about day in and day out. It has been said, honestly, it's been said by this speaker, that the clerical pederasty scandals amount to the elephant in the sacristy. That is true enough. But it is more accurate to speak of two elephants in the sacristy, each aiding and abetting one another. One is the decision by many in the laity to exempt themselves from fundamental church teaching, particularly about contraception. The other is the decision by some clergy to do the same, to exempt themselves from some other fundamental rules. In some cases, that priestly defiance has meant open homosexuality. In others, predatory conduct in some seminaries. And in others, this self-imposed exemption has crossed the line of criminal law into sex with minors. The point of this grievously familiar recitation is that it isn't only some clergy who need a new beginning here. The same laity now demanding a cleanup of the church, and rightly so, is overdue for some introspection of its own. The problem here is profound and systemic. It's that the scandals are not about isolated sins, but that they have arisen in a much wider context of corruption all around. An unholy deal was struck after Humanae Vitae that is no less corrosive for being tacit. According to that deal, the many laymen and women rejecting Humanae Vitae could receive communion anyway and otherwise consider themselves Catholics in good standing. And in exchange for that favor, some priests have apparently been openly flouting other laws of the church without much scrutiny at all until pretty recently. The laity's desire to live outside the law has effectively compromised the laity as the engine of renewal and cleanup that many people now want it to be. In other words, in order to rid the sacristy of one elephant, it's necessary to rid it of the other. Laxity about these matters never exists in isolation. This is why dissident faculty who promote same-sex marriage, for example, also promote communion for the divorced. The same sources also soft pedal or make exceptions concerning contraception. And they invoke the highly suspect identitarian term LGBT, etc., as the recourse of first resort for describing other human beings. They thereby capitulate in advance to one of the sexual revolution's unwritten laws, which is that I am whoever I say I am, not whoever God says I am. These are all building blocks of the collusive coalition of sexual interest groups that has defined much of the modern church. I would like to give another example here and invoke the case of former Cardinal McCarrick. Recall that in 2004, to the outrage of tradition-minded Catholics and to the joy of others, then Cardinal McCarrick downplayed a direct order about refusing communion to Catholic politicians who support abortion. Once again, apparent laxity about one aspect of the long-standing Christian code was linked to laxity about other matters. And now consider this question, which to my knowledge has not been asked by anyone yet. Without doubt, the sociable ex-cardinal was known to many powerful Catholics in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere, known for their pro-abortion policies. Did any of them ever hear of the scandals that have been tumbling forth since July? More to the point, did their enjoyment of his lax stance on communion and their gratitude for that laxity perhaps compromise their own eyes and ears? This is not just a rhetorical question. The United States has witnessed upward of 60 million abortions since Roe versus Wade. If Catholic politicians had not been backing pro-abortion policies these past 45 years without pushback from clergy and laity, some of those lives might have been saved. Maybe some refusals of communion to a few high-profile politicians might have blunted their enthusiasm for so-called freedom of choice. Maybe such public reminders of the Catechism might have pricked a conscience or two. Maybe even have attracted some non-Catholics into considering what it means to have a faith that sticks up for itself. We don't know what it would look like to hold Catholic politicians accountable as Catholics because the experiment hasn't really been run. But post-scandal, it needs to be. To heal the church of wink and nod Catholicism requires more than transparency. It requires that the laity come back into community with the magisterium. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment to seize for making that case. After all, the timing couldn't be more uncanny. Exactly 50 years after Humanae Vitae was issued, almost to the day, the church hierarchy found itself disgraced in the eyes of the world, accused of cover-ups and scandals on a scale that makes the Borgia years read like the sound of music. Consider, on July 25th of this year, the exact anniversary of the encyclical's issuance, Ross Douthat published a piece called The Truth About Cardinal McCarrick because it had just come out. That's how precisely the timing of these two events are related. Now, unlike some of the professionals here, I have no scholarly or other insights into providence. But maybe there is something providential for the church in this seemingly bizarre chronological alignment. It will be objected that recurring emphasis on the so-called pelvic issues amounts to a fastidious diversion from the immensely larger majesty of Catholic teaching. But the charge is false. The reason for emphasizing these issues above all is that this is where the dissent is, this is where the faithlessness flourishes, and this is where the scandals come from. The rocks on which Peter's bark have been crashing for 50 years are not those of social justice, but of the sexual revolution and the consequent rise of wink and nod Catholicism and the toleration of dissent. So let's close with the case for hope. Precisely at this raw moment, we can envision a different coalition rising in the church during the next 50 years, a coalition born not of a collective desire to carve exception from commandments, but rather a faithful fellowship arising organically and in part from the wreckage of the revolution itself. Some of the rank and file in this fellowship will have seen their lives blasted by pornography, or by cheap sex, or other compulsions and addictions. Some will be modern penitents who didn't even know what penance was, and can now thank the church for the hope of sanctification. Others in this struggling band of the faithful will enter by rejecting the empty claim of the age that humanity is just the sum of its appetites. Above all, this fellowship, already in the making, includes the men, women, and children who want the church purified and free once more to be the church, to stand as a sign of contradiction to the false anthropology of a corrupt time. The Catechism has a whole new world to offer these people. A clergy that wants its good name back might now find renewed vigor to shout these truths from the pulpit. A laity comprised less of indifferent cradle Catholics and more of zealous converts might reinvigorate catechesis, Catholic schools, and intentional communities. All of this is already happening in real time and with extra determination since the scandals broke. This fellowship of the Catholic future is already here and it's already coalescing, including here in Minnesota via the Siena Symposium, the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, the University of St. Thomas, and all the other sponsors who have sacrificed to create this fruitful event today. The new Catholic counterculture is already here, both figuratively and literally, and through it, Humanae Vitae may gain a different and way better hearing in the 50 years to come. Thank you. Thank you very much.